Of the BRICS summit, and the focus will be on the dialogue of emerging markets and developing countries. And it's very significant that today President Xi Jinping will just deliver a keynote speech over there around the round table behind me, and he will also just brief the outcomes of the meetings afterwards during a press conference, and he will also highlight the significance of the cooperation between BRICS countries and also other emerging markets. And we know that the 5+ emerging markets who will be attending the summit with other BRICS leaders will be the 5 countries, including Mexico, Tajikistan, Thailand, Guinea, and Egypt. And those leaders will be here for the discussion of promoting the economic global governance and also the cooperation in the near future, not only in trade, investment, but also industrial cooperation.
And that's our reporter Su Yuting in Xiamen. Now, gentlemen, as we wait for live signal of the arrival of BRICS leaders as well as leaders of 5 developing countries, let's talk more about this issue of representation in the BRICS bloc. It seems that over the past few days, BRICS leaders have been calling for a reform of the United Nations, calling for greater representation of this world body. Now, what do you think the BRICS bloc can do to improve the representation of the developing economy in the world?
Well, it's not the reputation, it's actually the inputs. You know, you have a situation where there are a lot of economies at the top, a few emerging, and then ones at the bottom. So
right.
You have this kind of sandwich approach. It's a multilateral world. It's no longer unipolar. So there has to be adjustments made, not only in the way that you think about it, but also the measurements. Because too often we still think in
又追剧了吧？别看太晚，小心黑眼圈哦。睡前擦点眼霜吧。上唯品会905美妆节，你喜欢的那些牌子特别划算，去看看吧。
That works very, very well. So it's not just this kind of random relationship. There is a lot of things. You know, you were talking about population. 60% of India's population is under 30.
Visit to China was at the G20 Hangzhou summit last September, and President Xi Jinping and President Al-Sisi also met in Cairo in January last year. And ahead of his trip to China, President Al-Sisi told Chinese media that Egypt will continue to support the BRICS mechanism and will further contribute to cooperation within the BRICS framework. So China and Egypt are working on several infrastructure projects, including the construction of its new administrative capital located east of Cairo. And these projects also cover electricity, energy development, as well as transportation. President Al-Sisi said his invitation to the BRICS Xiamen summit reflects the special bond between the two countries, as well as their strategic partnership. And as we know, Egypt is a major economy of Africa. It was Africa's third largest economy in 2016. Egypt runs the Suez Canal, which is one of the world's busiest maritime trade routes. So, Professor Fu, you were saying, talking about the achievements made in the BRICS bloc.
One
Would you like
particular
to pick
case
up,
to is down to production of, as of now, in 2016, it's with 1.5 million US dollars, and last year 4 projects with 1.4 million US dollars, areas of clean energy and infrastructure. So infrastructure and ideas. It seems to me when you're looking at the three dimensions simultaneously.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's billion.
What about you, Anna?
I think it's billions, not million.
Okay, yeah,
billions.
Yeah, 1 billion.
Yeah, 1.4 billion. 1.4 million might be a little small for an
Mm-hmm.
organization of this size. I would put it down in one category. I mean, particularly setting up this framework, the actual structure itself, the fact that you can have nations who are being bypassed, who just say, look, if we're gonna continue to be bypassed, we're gonna develop our own power, economic, political structure. And the second part of that is finance. Very important. They got together with the bank. They have set up mechanisms to prevent a run on their capital. Discount the fact that there's a vacuum being formed by the U.S. pulling out and the uncertainty that is creating.
It's also renegotiating terms in NAFTA and pulling out from the TPP.
There's that on India's side. Then you start looking on the resource side. I think you're seeing consensus models that make sense to everybody. Otherwise, why should they participate? Very important signals being sent. For the first time, you had China and India. This was a couple of days before the settlement at Dokon, who came forward and said, listen, U.S., Europe, You have to get rid of your agricultural subsidies. We're tired of you protecting your industries. Oh my goodness, what a sea change. This has always been the criticism by the developed countries of undeveloped countries that, we're tired of this. So the tables are in essence turning. You have two of the largest markets in the world, right? Europe and the United States cannot afford to be shut out of these markets if they're going to grow. And they're now starting to use their market power. And this is on the China and India side. Then you start looking on the resource side, I think you're seeing a resurgence. This is this multipolar world where no one is going to be able to dictate the terms of how everything operates. It's going to be a more consensus model where people arrive at models that make sense to everybody. Otherwise, why should they participate? Mm-hmm. So I think this is the real sea change that you're seeing here.
These countries all have their different agenda in terms of politics, in terms of economy. To what extent do you think their differences have prevented the bloc from growing stronger and becoming more influential in the world?
Well, if you only look at GDP per capita, you see variations within countries that would give you sensitivity to different stage of development. If you're looking at the two farthest growing economies, China and India, Chinese per capita GDP is somewhere of $8,000 US, whereas India is just $2,000 US. So the India's low GDP probably reflects a lower level of industrialization and urbanization, and they, of course, have their own priorities. And in terms of growth rates, of course, we can lump the 5 countries together and saying the BRIC countries continue to be the engine of the world economic growth. But the matter of fact is China is growing at above 6%. India is above 6%. A small drop from over 7% last year. But if you look at others, South Africa below 1%, Brazil and Russia negative growth rates. So they have different concerns. Of course, the structure of different economies are different, whereas the structure of Russia, for instance, probably is too much dependent on resources, and that potentially has a massive case of Dutch disease. It would be better for countries like Russia to diversify this economy.
Sure. Well, these countries have their differences, but they all have their difficulties as well. For example, some say that the group's influence is waning given the fact that the economic situation is deteriorating in countries like Brazil, Russia, and South Africa.
Well, I would dispute that. First off, these are cyclical economies. We're talking about resources. Resources don't go down forever. We've known that. They don't go up forever. We've seen that. So, all of this stuff is saying, yes, they do have to balance this. But by putting these markets and these resources together, what you're doing is you're offering this sense that, look, we know there will be ups and downs in the resource market. If we can create a mechanism like BRICS, where we can take care of each other during the downtimes and then ameliorate all of the up times, we can be successful together. This is the whole point. How do you create structures which are going to be beneficial long term? These are countries that are going to be there forever. All right, so how do you set this up? And I think this is the brilliance of that. This is not a command and control type of operation that you have with the UN and the IMF and the World Bank. This is really about very, very inclusive. How do we help each other? It's very, very pragmatic. So I think this is one of the hallmarks of this. You increasingly see China taking a very pragmatic approach. Look, we're not going to judge your country. We want to trade with it. To the extent that we can increase your prosperity, this is going to be good for everybody. Mm-hmm. This is very, very different from the Western-led model, which is very heavily ideological. They say, look, along with our help, you need to change things. You need to come into line with what we believe is the future of the world. A lot of countries have rejected that. Or in certain cases where they've adopted it, it hasn't worked out the way it was supposed to. So increasingly, there's just, there is a difference, and the numbers portray that. But emotionally, do not forget nationalism. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of countries have developed this sense of identity, but it can also get in the way, as we saw with, between India and China, the papers were much more virulent than the actual governments. The governments were quite calm, and they were handling this behind closed doors and thinking of the next step. But the popular press was screaming all sorts of things which could have really inflamed the situation.
And really, it depends on how you look at it from your perspective. We could say that it was the best of times and it was the worst of times.
President Xi Jinping, by the way, come up with a very, I think, insightful way of looking at the role that BRIC countries has been playing. He said there are two dimensions. One dimension is where you need to look at the BRIC countries as a part of human history, the very dramatic transformation of the economic landscape globally. The other is to appreciate BRICS, and you look at that from the perspective of each country. So when you look at the role of BRICS from the two perspectives, that would get you sensitive to both the very dramatic structural change that's happening in the world, and also when you look at the BRIC countries from the perspective of your own country, you need to be sensitive to your own stage of development. And incidentally to that, he also added the dial of cooperation. In other words, cooperation, the model of cooperation in the area of cooperation, one size does not fit all. You have to be sensitive to your own conditions.
Absolutely. Well, dramatic changes are taking place in the world. For example, rising protectionism, and this topic has been increasingly taken up by China, by President Xi Jinping. So in what ways do you think the BRICS economies can keep adapting themselves to these new realities and to respond to these changing challenges?
Well, first off, they're doing what they set out to do, which is create an alternative structure that allows them to do this. Also, it's slow and steady. They look at each other around the table and they say, okay, let's see what we can agree on. How do we go forward? I mean, the joint security announcement that they made, they said, look, we're going to name these groups that we believe are bad. And they put aside geopolitical, I should say domestic political issues and friendships, and just said we have to call it what it is. Mm-hmm. And this was a big step for a lot of the nations involved here. So, but, you know, people should resist this idea that this is like a game of cricket where you're scoring. This is not that. This is the long term. How do you create this kind of environment going forward? I think you have something coming up.
Right. Let's wait and see who's arriving right now. President Vladimir Putin from Russia. Russia was one of the 4 founding members of the original 4-country group. And the last time Russia held a BRIC summit was in 2015 in Ufa. During the Ufa summit, important documents like the Ufa Declaration and Strategy for BRICS Economic Partnership were signed. Ahead of his arrival, President Putin published a signed article on Xinhua's website, that's China's largest news agency, and the article was titled Towards New Horizons of Strategic Partnership. In it, he urged all members to carry on the principle of equality and respect in cooperation. And he also swore to continue working with partners in fields like foreign policies, anti-terrorism operations, and global information security. So as I just mentioned, gentlemen, equality and respect is given great significance to the framework of the BRIC summit. But considering the many differences from within the bloc, how possible is it to achieve full equality and respect from within the bloc? Mr. Tengen?
Well, respect is things, and I think China has consistently demonstrated. If you talk to ambassadors who have come to Beijing, they're thrilled with the fact that they get real time, and they are accorded every respect, no matter how small they are. Now, in terms of equality, there's never going to be full equality. I mean, the economic numbers are what they are. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think anybody says, look, I'm a small country with a very small GDP. I should be treated exactly like Russia. okay, or China. It's just simply, do you have access? Can you create change? Can you bring your issues to the table and at least expect them to be heard in a respectful manner? I mean, increasing within the United Nations and the existing bodies, there's this feeling that you have to stand in line, and quite frankly, no one will hear. You will not get any press coverage. You will not get any opportunity to substantiate real change.
Now we are seeing live signal from Xiamen, where Chinese President Xi Jinping is welcoming leaders of the BRICS nations as well as other emerging markets. And the meeting this morning is known as the 5+5 meeting, which brings together the 5 BRICS nations as well as other 5 emerging markets. And as we mentioned earlier, this is a privilege of the host nation to bring together, to invite countries that are economically and strategically important to the host country. And this is a photo opportunity for world leaders, mostly from emerging markets. And of course, this is a new model proposed by China, the 5+5. It's aiming for greater representation of the world economy. And the leaders are walking into the meeting room where they're going to make their keynote speeches and discuss trade and economy as well as anti-terrorism cooperation. If you've just joined us, this is our special live coverage of the ongoing BRICS summit taking place in China's southeastern city of Xiamen. And right now, Chinese President Xi Jinping is meeting with leaders of some of the world's biggest developing economies. And together they're going to map out the future of the development of emerging markets. As the BRICS summit enters its second decade, hopes are high that countries are going to work together with more solid cooperation to achieve a golden second decade of coordination and cooperation. And the BRICS summit also features bilateral discussions. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi are expected to meet later today after this 5+5 meeting on bilateral issues. And the BRICS leaders also met at the G20 summit in Hamburg, Germany earlier this year to map out their agenda in Xiamen. So, gentlemen, as we mentioned, this year, one of this year's priorities is anti-terrorism cooperation. So why is it important for these emerging markets to fight terrorism as they achieve to develop their economies, Professor?
Well, to keep a peaceful environment is very critical for economic growth, and countries, China, India, continue to face the threat of terrorism. So terrorism is also an important topic on agenda. And it's not only on the topic exclusively for this year. It was a topic for previous BRICS meetings.
As we mentioned, the BRICS economies are trying to adapt to new world realities and to upgrade their economic mechanisms to respond to new challenges. If you were to make a list, Mr. Tangen, what will top your concern list in this year's BRICS summit?
Okay, first is just to have a peaceful one. What's very important here is that Xi Jinping and the rest have not allowed the North Korean situation to hijack this agenda. They've continued along with the trade and development and security that they wanted to do here. So I think that's very important. They've shown a very, very steady resolve in the midst of a very difficult situation.
Distinguished colleagues,
女士们、先生们、朋友们，
ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning.
现在我宣布，
And I
新兴市场国家
declare
与发展中国家对话会
opening
开始，
of the dialogue of emerging market and developing countries.
热烈欢迎大家出席
I warmly welcome you all
新兴市场国家
to
与
this
发展中
dialogue
国
of
家对
emerging
话会。
market and developing countries.
金砖国家在领导人会晤
When we
期间，
BRICS leaders meet,
注重同其
we
他
attach
新兴市场
importance
国家和
to
发展中国
communication
家
with
进
other
行
emerging market
沟通交流。
and developing countries.
中方今年有所创
Well,
新，
this year, the Chinese side has made some
邀请了
innovation by
来自
inviting
不同地区有代表
countries
性的国
with
家
representation
出席
from
今
different
天的会晤
regions
对话会。
to the dialogue.
相信这种对
I'm
话有
confident
利于
that the
新兴
dialogue
市场
will
国家
strengthen
和发展中国家
solidarity
加强团结
and cooperation
有
among
利
the
于
emerging market and developing
金砖
countries
自身
and also contribute
金砖机制的自身发
to
展。
the building of the BRICS mechanism.
今天大家能够聚到一起啊，非常难
It is
得。
indeed not easy for us to get together for this
很多
dialogue
同
today.
事
I know that
是
many of
远道而来，
my colleagues have traveled a long
有
distance,
的还专门为出席
and some of you have
对话会调整了
rescheduled your
行
program
程安排。
to attend the dialogue.
我们对此表示感谢。
I'd like to extend heartfelt thanks to all of you.
我期待同大家围绕深化互利
Under the
合
theme
作
of strengthening mutually beneficial cooperation for common development,
共商发
I
展合作大
look
局，
forward
为深化南南
to
合作
discussing the important issue of development cooperation with you in order to inject strong impetus to deepening South-South cooperation and implementing the 2030 Sustainable
我将代表中方
2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development according to the program
之后
of the dialogue.
我
I will
将
make a
请
statement
各位领
on
导人
behalf of the Chinese side
依次
first.
发言。
Then I will invite the leaders
最后
to give their statement.
我做一个
And at the end of the
简短的
dialogue, I will
总结
give a brief summary of our discussion.
如果大家对会议议程
If there's no
没有意见，
objection to the agenda,
我将首先做一个发
I
言。
will make a statement first.
各位同事，
Dear colleagues,
进入新世纪以来，
since we
新
entered
兴
the
市场国家
21st
和发
century,
展中国家群体
the
崛起
collective rise of emerging market
成为
and
不可
developing
逆转
countries
的
has
时
become
代潮流。
an irreversible trend of our
近
times.
几年，
In recent years,
这些国家对世界经济增长的
these
贡献率
countries
稳居
have
高位。
made more contribution to global economic growth than
2016
others,
年达到80%，
accounting for 80% of global growth in
是当之
2016.
无愧的主引擎。
They are worthy of the reputation as the primary engine of the world
近期
economy.
世界经济呈现向好
As the
态势，
latest developments
国
suggest,
际贸易
the
和
global
投资
economy
回升，
is looking up, and international
新一
trade
轮
and
科技和
investment
工业
are
革命
picking up.
蓄势
A new
待
round
发
of technological and industrial
新产业
revolution
新技
is
术
gathering momentum.
新业态
New industries, new
成熟
technologies, and new business models are emerging.
从这个意义上
In
讲，
this context,
新兴市场国家和发展中
emerging
国家
market
面
and
临难得
developing
的
countries
发展
face
机
a
遇。
rare opportunity of development.
同时，我们也要看到，
That said,
世界
we
经
should
济
not
下行
lose
风
sight
险
of the growing risks of downward pressure and uncertainties in the world economy. Multilateral trade negotiations are stalled, and the implementation of the Paris Agreement on climate change is encountering resistance. Some countries have become more inward-looking and less inclined to engage in international development cooperation, and the spillovers of their policy adjustment are deepening. As the world economy enters a crucial stage where new drivers of growth are replacing traditional ones at a quicker pace, there is mounting competition focused on interests and rules. This makes the external environment for emerging market and developing countries more complex and challenging. A boat sailing against the currents has to forge ahead or risks falling behind. Given the new circumstances, emerging market and developing countries need to pull together and work hand in hand more confidently to foster a favorable environment for greater development and make bigger contribution to global growth. First, we need to work more closely to build an open world economy. In an increasingly interdependent and integrated world where countries form a community of shared interests, openness, inclusiveness, and win-win cooperation are the only viable option. The beggar-thy-neighbor practice or zero-sum game will not help world economic growth, but will undermine, first and foremost, the interests of emerging market and developing countries. We need to advocate a noble world economy, firmly support the multilateral trading regime, oppose protectionism, and rebalance economic globalization to make it more inclusive and equitable. We need to strengthen coordination on positions, work toward a positive outcome at the upcoming 11th WTO Ministerial Conference, make progress on the remaining items of the Doha Development Round, and provide direction to the multilateral trading regime. We need to promote greater representation and a voice of emerging market and developing countries in global economic governance, and foster an international economic order that is fairer and more equitable. Second, we need to work more closely to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Development remains the top priority for emerging market and developing countries. We need to implement our national development strategies in the context of the Sustainable Development Agenda and in light of our respective national conditions. This will help us find a path of sustainable development featuring coordinated economic, social, and ecological progress. We need to call on the international community to place development high on the agenda of macro policy coordination, better leverage the role of the United Nations, make good use of the high-level political forum on sustainable development, and accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Agenda. We need to urge developed countries to honor their commitments, to observe such principles as common but differentiated responsibilities, and to increase support to developing countries. As the United Nations is considering reform of its development system, we need to ensure that the reform will focus on development and bring more input to truly serve the need of developing countries. Third, we need to work more closely to seize the historic opportunities of world economic restructuring. A new round of technological and industrial revolution has generated new growth drivers and brought to us development opportunities like never before. Seizing the opportunities, the emerging market and developing countries may even get ahead in development. If the opportunities are missed, the north-south gap and the development imbalance will grow even wider. We must take bold steps of innovation and reform, press ahead with economic structural adjustment, and invigorate domestic drivers for growth. At the same time, we must formulate our social policy in a way that meets people's basic needs and work all out to ensure a better life for our people. We need to enhance complementarity of our development strategies, particularly in such areas as infrastructure development, science and technology, education, and industry.
4. 加强团结协作，共同建设广泛。
Fourth, we need to work more closely to build extensive partnerships.
一花不是春，
As the Chinese saying goes, a single flower does not herald spring. A single wild goose cannot make a formation. Emerging market and developing countries face similar development tasks. By deepening practical cooperation and tapping into complementarity, we can multiply the impact. We need to make good use of BRICS, G77, and other similar mechanisms, broaden South-South cooperation on a larger scale, and jointly address global challenges. We also need to forge chains of interconnected development and seek strength through unity. The purpose of inviting some representative developing countries from different regions to this dialogue is to foster a broad network of development partnerships and to build a community of common development and a shared future. Dear colleagues, China sets great store by the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We have developed a national program to implement the agenda and set up innovation demonstration zones on sustainable development. Thanks to these efforts, we have attained early harvests on economic, social, environmental, and many other fronts. Internationally, China will work through such mechanisms as the Assistance Fund for South-South Cooperation, China UN Peace and Development Fund, and South-South Climate Cooperation Fund to boost cooperation on development and help fellow developing countries in implementing the Sustainable Development Agenda. Here I wish to announce that China will provide $500 million to the Assistance Fund for South-South Cooperation. The money will be used to help fellow developing countries tackle famine, refugee, climate change, public health, and other challenges. China will enhance development experience sharing and capacity building cooperation with other countries through such platforms as the Center for International Knowledge on Development and the Academy of South-South Cooperation and Development. We will provide other developing countries with 40,000 training opportunities in China in the coming year. 4 years ago, I put forward the idea of building a Silk Road economic belt and the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. The initiative received warm response from the international community. In May this year, China hosted a successful Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation. Together with the participating countries and international organizations, we outlined a vision of future cooperation under the Belt and Road Initiative and proposed concrete measures to support countries along the Belt and Road in pursuing sustainable development. It was widely agreed that the philosophy and vision of the Belt and Road Initiative and its focus on policy, infrastructure, trade, financial, and people-to-people connectivity have much in common with the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and the two can very well complement and reinforce each other. The Belt and Road is as much a path of cooperation as one of hope and mutual benefit. As a follow-up to the outcomes of the Belt and Road Forum, China will develop cooperation with interested countries in infrastructure connectivity, production capacity, technological innovation, and other fields. A Chinese writer over 200 years ago once observed, "Is there anything too hard in the world? With determined efforts, a hard task becomes easy. Otherwise, an easy job may become difficult." Emerging market and developing countries represent the future of world development. It is our duty to promote international cooperation on development and implement the Sustainable Development Agenda. Let us work together to blaze a new path to development that is fair, open, comprehensive, and innovative.
这是我代表中方
Well, this is the statement I made on the Chinese side.
下面呢，就请
I
各位
now
同事畅所
open
欲
up the
言。
floor for discussions.
首先，
First,
请
I
塞西
invite President Al-Sisi of Egypt to speak.
Well, that was live signal coming to us from Xiamen, where President Xi Jinping was addressing leaders of the BRICS nations as well as other emerging markets. And now let's get some more discussion on President Xi Jinping's keynote speech just now. So President Xi just pledged $500 million in South-South cooperation to help develop these emerging markets. How important is this money to South-South cooperation?
My understanding is that money will be used to help the bottom line. That would probably, the additional money will be used to help to fight against the poverty. In the spirit of shared prosperity, it is very important when you are in the business of developing the economy, you must have basic infrastructure, basic education, so that you are not just give money, but you help people to learn, so that you have the basic foundation for sustained development. And he was doing this in terms of sustained development goals, and that should be understood in the general framework of the UN Sustainable 2030 development goals.
Right. So when it comes to help developing economies, it seems that funding is one of the most important issues. So how do you think the countries will take advantage of the $500 million?
Well, there are project proposals. This is the assistance fund. I mean, it's just like the BRICS bank, the new bank,
development bank.
Development bank. There's a process by which people can apply for funds, and certain parts are earmarked. But what's important about this is he's establishing goals, and then means and methods, and then funding them. You know, too often you hear soaring rhetoric, but there's no plan, and there's certainly no money. And this comes at a time when the U.S. is pulling back. So there are these real